Cowboy confronts an 85-year-old Apache. 30 minutes later, the son arrives with his own clan. But what started as a simple trespassing dispute was about to turn into something no one could have. Foreseen, Garrett McKinley spotted the old man from 100 yards away, seated motionless by the creek that cut through his ranch. The Apache's weathered hands rested atop a gnarled walking stick, his long gray hair catching the midday sun like fine silver threads. He looked fragile, almost spectral against the backdrop of twisted cottonwoods and the whispering grass. Garrett's jaw tightened as he spurred his horse forward, the irritation rising with every hoof beat. This was his land bought with backbreaking labor, paid for in calloused hands and sleepless nights. 16-hour days had shaped this place from raw wilderness into a working ranch. He wasn't about to let some wandering Indian treat it like open range. The closer he rode, the hotter the anger burned in his gut. The old man hadn't even acknowledged his approach. He just sat there, like he belonged to the land more than Garrett ever could. Like generations of McKinleys hadn't bled and fought to tame this patch of frontier, Garrett dismounted 20 feet away, his boots hitting the hard earth with a purposeful thud. The Apache finally lifted his gaze, revealing eyes so deep and unreadable they seemed carved from time itself. But Garrett saw only defiance. "You're trespassing, old man," Garrett snapped, his voice sharp as dry pine breaking. "This is private property." The Apache's expression didn't flicker. He simply gestured toward the creek, where clear water curled over smooth stones. "Water calls to all living things," Joseph Red Hawk said quietly, his English deliberate but clear. "I meant no harm." "I don't care what you meant," Garrett bit back. "You can't just wander onto people's land because you're thirsty. There's a town 5 miles east with a well." Memories from childhood twisted inside him campfire. Tales of raids, of livestock stolen, of families slaughtered while they slept. This old man might look harmless, but Garrett knew appearances were liars. Indians were Indians. Trouble always followed. "I'll walk," Joseph said, forcing himself upright with the help of his stick. His legs trembled under him like wine-beaten branches, and for a moment it looked like he might fall back onto the dirt. Garrett watched, arms crossed, a muscle jumping in his jaw. A part of him wanted to help, but another part, the part carved out by his father's teachings, told him no. That's how it always started, a little kindness. And suddenly they thought they had a claim to your whole damn ranch. "Make it quick," Garrett said, coldly, "and don't come back." But as Joseph Red Hawk took his first unsteady step away from the creek, something happened that shifted everything. His walking stick snagged on a root hidden beneath the soil. He stumbled forward, his body crashing to the ground with a strangled cry. His ribs hit first. Then his head struck a stone with a sickening thud. He lay there, still. Garrett stared, a storm of emotion crashing through him. He hadn't laid a hand on the man, but he knew how it would look. An Apache elder, dead or dying on his property. There wasn't a sheriff alive who wouldn't ask hard questions. And there sure as hell wasn't an Apache alive who'd believe Garrett's word over a bloodstain in the dirt. "Hey," Garrett called, his voice rougher than he meant it to. "B, old man, you all right?" Joseph's eyelids fluttered, but his focus was distant. He groaned as he tried to sit up, one hand gripping his side. "My ribs," he gasped, each breath catching like a knife. Something broken. Garrett swore under his breath. This was bad, real bad. Leaving an old man to die would haunt him, maybe not in daylight, but in the quiet moments when guilt came hunting. But helping him, that was dangerous too. It meant witnesses, complications, the kind of mess that could burn down a life in one careless spark. Garrett glanced toward the horizon, scanning for movement. Any moment now, someone could come riding over that rise. A cousin, a grandson, a war party. And what would they see? Their elder lying broken in the dirt while a white man stood over him, rifle in hand, his guts twisted. "Look," Garrett said, kneeling despite every alarm ringing in his mind. "I didn't push you. You fell on your own." Joseph Red Hawk blinked up at him, something unreadable passing through those ancient eyes. Understanding, maybe, or resignation, but no blame. "I know," he said simply. "You helped me to shade." Every bone in Garrett's body resisted. His father's voice rang in his ears. Don't show weakness. Don't open the door. But Garrett reached out anyway, helping Joseph upright, guiding him with care beneath a wide cottonwood. The old man felt weightless, a bundle of bones wrapped in leather and history. Water, Joseph whispered. Garrett handed him the canteen and watched as he sipped, slow and trembling. Up close, the old man's clothing came into focus, leather vest adorned with hand-stitched beadwork, each strand of hair braided with small, deliberate ornaments. This wasn't a drifter. This was someone with a legacy etched into every thread. "What's your name?" Garrett asked before he realized the words were coming. "Joseph Redhawk." The old man replied. "And you are?" "Garrett McKinley. This is my land." Joseph nodded, slow and deliberate. "Good land, good water. My grandfather hunted here long ago." The words landed like a blow to the chest. This wasn't trespassing. This was memory ritual. A tie that ran deeper than deeds and surveys. Before Garrett could process that, Joseph spoke again so quietly it barely rose above the creek. "My son. He will wonder where I am. He worries when I wander too far." "Your son." Garrett's voice cracked. "Thomas Redhawk. He leads our people now." The name hit like a bullet between the ribs. Garrett had heard it spoken in saloons and town halls. Thomas Redhawk, respected, feared, legendary. The Apache chief who kept peace when others demanded blood. The one who negotiated deals with the government and tracked down outlaws when lawmen failed. And this man, this injured, fragile elder, was his father. Thomas Redhawk is your son? Garrett asked, his mouth suddenly dry. Joseph nodded again, slower this time. "He is a good son, protective, when the sun begins to set, and I have not returned." He gestured east, his fingers trembling. "He will gather the young ones. He will come." Garrett's stomach flipped. He imagined Thomas cresting the ridge, finding his father battered on white man's land. There would be no trial, no questions, only justice, the kind delivered at the tip of a spear or the barrel of a rifle. "I need to get you back to your people," Garrett said urgently, springing to his feet. But as Joseph tried to rise, he crumpled with a hoarse cry, his face drained of color. Sweat pooled on his brow despite the cool shade. "Cannot ride," Joseph gasped. "Ribs, maybe lung." Garrett's pulse pounded in his ears. He couldn't move the man. He couldn't leave him. And with every second, the threat grew nearer. That's when he heard it. The thunder of hooves, dozens of them rolling across the prairie like an oncoming storm. Organized. Fast, too many for chance. Joseph heard it too. Their eyes met. In Joseph's was something terrible and soft. "Not anger, pity, double quotes they come." Joseph murmured. Garrett snatched his rifle from the saddle, fingers trembling as he checked the chamber. 6 rounds, that was it. 6 bullets against however many warriors Thomas Redhawk would bring. The sound grew louder, hoofbeats disciplined. Rhythmic echoed over the land like war drums. Garrett's instinct screamed for cover, for action, for anything, but his legs wouldn't move. He turned to Joseph, who sat limply beneath the tree. Then the dust appeared, curling over the ridge like smoke. 2 minutes. He had 2 minutes to rewrite the ending to this story. Then they appeared, 8 Apache riders, silhouetted like spirits, against the blazing sky. At their head rode a man carved from power and purpose, Thomas Redhawk. His shoulders broad, his presence undeniable. He rode like a hawk in flight, silent, swift, lethal. Garrett's finger twitched on the trigger, but before he could raise the weapon, Joseph's frail hand gripped his wrist, sudden and fierce. "No," the old man said, voice low and urgent. "If you point that weapon at my son, there will be no words that can save you." The war party slowed, their horses snorting, stamping, the air thick with dust and tension. Thomas Redhawk dismounted in one fluid motion, eyes already locked on his father beneath the tree. What Garrett saw in those eyes stopped his breath. Not rage, something colder, controlled fury. Thomas Redhawk was younger than the stories made him. Seemed perhaps 45, with scars on his face like chapters of battles survived. His long black hair blew around him like a banner, his clothing a marriage of tradition and utility. At his hip hung a blade that looked more like an extension of his arm than a weapon. He spoke in Apache. One word, "Father," and it cut through the space between them like steel. Joseph answered his son in their native tongue, his voice weak but deliberate, his hand gesturing faintly toward Garrett. The exchange was short, the syllables unfamiliar, but Garrett could feel the meaning woven through their cadence and attempt to de-escale it, to explain, to calm. Thomas Redhawk's dark eyes never left Garrett. They studied him with the cold precision of a predator, deciding whether the creature before him was threat or prey. The weight of that gaze was almost physical, like standing beneath the looming shadow of a thunderhead. When Thomas finally spoke, his English was flawless, educated, cultured, which somehow made him more terrifying than if he'd shouted in anger. "You are on your land," he said, and it wasn't a question. "Yes, sir," Garrett replied, hating the way his voice came out tight, uncertain. "This is my property." "Your father was trespassing." Again, not a question, just a statement of fact that sounded like an accusation. Thomas took a step closer. Garrett had to fight the twitch in his hand that wanted to lift the rifle. Around them, the other warriors remained on horseback, silent as statues, their weapons within easy reach, every move calculated, every heartbeat in sync. "Tell me what happened," Thomas commanded. Garrett stumbled through the story. He spoke of seeing Joseph at the creek, the confrontation, the old man's stubborn silence, and the fall that had left him crumpled beneath the cottonwood tree. Thomas never interrupted, never blinked, his face a mask carved in granite. But Garrett could feel the judgment radiating off him like desert heat. "You offered my father water," Thomas observed flatly once the story ended. "Well, yes, he was hurt, but first, you told him to leave." The words cut like a blade. The accusation hung in the still air between them, thicker than dust, more suffocating than heat. Garrett's face flushed. "He was trespassing," Garrett said defensively, forcing steel into his voice. "I had a right to." "You had a right," Thomas interrupted, his voice deadly calm. "Just as I have rights." The words weren't loud, they didn't need to be. The warning inside them was unmistakable. Garrett glanced at the mounted warriors, did the math. If this turned bloody, he wouldn't last 30 seconds. Then Joseph Redhawk's voice rose again, stronger this time. He spoke in Apache, and Thomas listened. As his father spoke, Thomas's expression shifted slightly, but enough. When the elder finished, a long silence followed. Then Thomas turned back to Garrett, his tone unreadable. "My father says you helped him when you could have turned away. He says you brought him water and shade when he was in pain." Garrett didn't know if this was a reprieve or simply a more detailed list of his failings. "He also says," Thomas continued, "that you were afraid." The truth struck like a whip. Garrett had been terrified, still was, and those words dragged that fear into the open. He hated how exposed they made him feel. "Wouldn't you be?" Garrett asked quietly, surprising even himself with the honesty in his voice. Something flickered in Thomas's eyes, a glint that might have been respect, or at least recognition. "Yes," he said, "I would be." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, it was a reckoning, a quiet, unspoken acknowledgement of two men from opposite worlds standing at a narrow, dangerous crossroads. Thomas moved to kneel beside his father. "Can you ride?" he asked gently. Joseph shook his head, ribs maybe broken. Thomas's jaw tensed as he carefully inspected his father's condition. Then he stood slowly, straightening to his full height. The air around him shifted. No longer a son, now a leader. "My father cannot be moved safely. He needs rest, medical attention." Garrett's gut clenched. "He'll need to stay here," Thomas said, "until he heals." Garrett felt like the ground had dropped from beneath him. This was the nightmare he'd been trying to avoid. "For how long?" he asked, voice strained. Thomas's smile held no warmth. "As long as it takes." The sun beat down, relentless, as the full weight of Thomas's words settled into Garrett's bones. Days, maybe weeks. An Apache elder convalescing on his ranch would stir gossip faster than wildfire. Neighbors would talk. The authorities might investigate. Rumors would fly. His reputation, already brittle, could shatter completely. "Now wait just a minute," Garrett began, but Thomas silenced him with a look that turned marrow to ice. "My father is injured on your land," Thomas said evenly. Apache law and white man's law both say you bear responsibility. I didn't hurt him. He fell on his own. Yes, Thomas agreed, his voice hardening. And yet, here we are. It was maddening, the logic twisted, but ironclad. Garrett could see there was no point in arguing. Thomas Redhawk hadn't risen to power by giving men like him an easy way out. Look, Garrett tried another approach. I've got a ranch to run, cattle to tend. I can't have, you will have help, Thomas said, cutting him off. Again the words hit like a hammer. Help 2 of my warriors will remain here. They will tend to my father and assist with your cattle. The way Thomas said cattle made it sound trivial, like swatting flies. But there was no insult, just practicality. Garrett looked at the warriors, tried to imagine explaining their presence to anyone in town. They'd think he'd lost his mind. People will talk, he muttered. They'll think. They will think you are honoring a debt, Thomas said firmly, which you are. Before Garrett could object, Joseph Redhawk's voice rose again from beneath the tree. He spoke in Apache, and Thomas's features softened not much, but enough to show the words had landed. My father reminds me, Thomas said, glancing back at Garrett, that you could have left him to die, that you did not, that you gave him water when there was no obligation. He paused, looking into Garrett's face with searching eyes. He believes there is honor in you, despite your fear. I'm not afraid, Garrett said quickly. A lie. Thomas's smile returned, sharper than steel. Yes, you are, he said, and that is wise. Fear keeps men alive when courage fails them. Joseph called out again, his voice thinner, weaker. Thomas rushed to his side, kneeling low. The old man whispered something in Apache, and whatever it was, it sent a shadow across Thomas's face. He stayed beside his father a long while, one hand resting gently on the old man's shoulder. It was an unguarded moment. No war paint, no pride. Just a son trying to hold his father a little longer. What did he say? Garrett asked, the words slipping out. Before he could stop them, Thomas stood slowly, his face grim. He says the pain is worse, that he fears internal bleeding. There was a new urgency in Thomas's voice now, something Garrett hadn't heard before. Worry. Desperation. My father needs medicine. White man's medicine. Or he may not survive the night. The world tilted sideways. Garrett saw it, the dominoes all lined up. If Joseph died here, under his care, it wouldn't matter what the truth was. The Redhawks would see it as murder. But the doctor, Garrett said, his throat dry, he won't come out here for an Indian. Thomas's eyes locked onto his, hard and cold. Then you will have to convince him, he said. And that sentence hung like a verdict. If Joseph Redhawk died here, it would be on Garrett's head. The wrath of Thomas Redhawk would be swift, unforgiving, and entirely justified. Garrett stared at him, torn between terror and duty. Then he surprised himself. Without another word, he strode to his horse and swung into the saddle. I'll get the doctor, he said. Thomas studied him for a beat. Dr. Morrison will not come willingly, he said. He has strong feelings about my people. Then, I'll change his mind. Something shifted in Thomas's gaze, not approval, but a nod to Garrett's resolve. Take Swift Arrow with you, he said, gesturing to one of the mounted warriors. If Morrison refuses, perhaps seeing one of us will clarify his obligations. The warrior dismounted. He looked young, maybe 25, with sharp, intelligent eyes and war paint still lingering on his cheekbones. He moved like water, smooth and silent, and stepped toward Garrett's horse. That might make things worse, Garrett muttered. He wasn't sure why he cared. He'd never even liked Morrison. Or it might make them honest. Thomas replied, Swift Arrow speaks English. He'll know if Morrison lies. There was no time left to argue. Joseph's breathing had become ragged, shallow. A gray pallor was spreading across his face like dusk across a dying sky. Garrett and Swift Arrow rode hard toward town. Dust trailed behind them, the land a blur of golden grass and jagged stone. Neither man spoke. They didn't need to. The stakes galloped beside them. The town emerged on the horizon just as the sun began to bleed into the sky. Garrett had made this ride countless times, but never with an Apache warrior at his side, never with a man's life hanging in the balance. They rode into the heart of town at a dead sprint. Heads turned, curtains twitched, whispers followed them like ghosts. Garrett didn't care. He dismounted and stormed into the white clapboard building that housed Dr. Morrison's office. Swift arrow right behind him. The doctor looked up from his desk, his eyes narrowing instantly. "McKinley, what in God's name?" "I need you to come to my ranch," Garrett interrupted. "There's a man dying." Morrison's gaze flicked to Swift arrow. His face hardened. "What kind of man?" "The kind that bleeds red like the rest of us," Garrett snapped. "Are you a doctor or not?" "I don't treat Indians," Morrison said flatly. Swift arrow stepped forward, his presence filling the room like thunder clouds. "The man dying is Joseph Red Hawk," he said, his English crisp, precise, respected elder of our people. "His son, Thomas Red Hawk, leads warriors who do not forget insults." Morrison paled. Everyone in the territory knew what Thomas Red Hawk's loyalty meant, and what his vengeance could look like. "You're threatening me," Morrison whispered. "I am explaining consequences," Swift arrow said calmly. Garrett stood between them, a bridge between two storms, and for the first time in his life, he understood that fear was no longer his enemy. "Doc," he said quietly, "Joseph Red Hawk is dying on my land." If Joseph Red Hawk died, Thomas would hold Garrett responsible, and if Thomas held him responsible, Garrett didn't need to finish the thought. Morrison understood. If Garrett ended up dead because of this, the doctor would be the sole witness to everything said here, the only man who could have saved a life but didn't. "I'll need my medical bag," Morrison said at last, his voice heavy with reluctant duty. "Already in your buggy," Swift arrow replied with the faintest trace of a smile. Morrison turned toward him, stunned. "How did you?" "We've been watching you since we arrived," Swift arrow said evenly. "Thomas Red Hawk doesn't leave important matters to chance." As they mounted up and began the ride back, Garrett sat in silence, the full weight of what was unfolding settling into his chest. Everything he'd assumed had been wrong. This wasn't some random incident, not a misunderstanding about trespassing or injured livestock. The Apache hadn't stumbled into this situation. They had planned, watched, waited, and now that Garrett saw it clearly, a much more unsettling question gnawed at him with every beat of the horse's hooves. If they had been watching Dr. Morrison, what else had they been watching? And more importantly, what did Thomas Red Hawk really want? The 15 miles back to the ranch stretched on forever, the tension riding with them like a third horseman. Morrison sat stiffly in his buggy, every muscle braced, the very image of a man trying to cling to professional composure. While fear crackled beneath the surface, Swift arrow rode beside them, his silent presence as sharp and unavoidable as the point of a blade. When they reached the creek, the change in the landscape was astonishing. The Apache had constructed a small, makeshift shelter using nearby branches and Garrett's own saddle blankets. It provided both shade and privacy, a respectful attempt to give dignity to their fallen elder. Thomas Red Hawk knelt beside his father, murmuring in Apache, his voice low and filled with care as he checked his breathing. Morrison approached slowly, clutching his medical bag like it was the only solid thing in a world that had tilted sideways. Up close, the seriousness of Joseph's condition couldn't be ignored. His skin had taken on a waxy pallor, and his breaths came shallow and labored. "I'll need to examine him," Morrison said, barely above a whisper. Thomas nodded, then spoke softly to Joseph in their native tongue. The old man's eyes opened, meeting the doctor's with quiet dignity and the look of someone who had made peace with pain. "He gives permission," Thomas translated. What followed was the most nerve-wracking medical examination Garrett had ever witnessed. Morrison moved with a practiced hand, gentle and thorough, though his discomfort was written plainly on his face. Every motion he made was under scrutiny. The Apache watched him with unblinking focus, no hostility, just an unspoken warning. "To no harm to broken ribs," Morrison finally announced. "One has partially punctured the lung. There's internal bleeding, but it's not yet critical. He'll need rest, pain medication, and to be monitored closely, but he should recover." Relief broke over Thomas's face like the first rain after drought. It was the first crack in his stoic demeanor, a flash of raw emotion that made Garrett Realize how deeply this man felt beneath all the quiet strength. How long? Thomas asked. 2 weeks minimum before he's safe to travel, Morrison replied. A month would be better. Thomas turned to Garrett. You heard him. My father will remain here while he recovers. Morrison packed his tools with brisk efficiency, eager to put distance between himself and this place. I'll need to check on him in 3 days, and if his condition worsens, you will come immediately. Swift Arrow added, calm but firm. This we understand. After the doctor left, a thick silence settled. Garrett found himself standing with 8 Apache warriors on his land, now solely responsible for the safety and healing of their revered elder. Garrett cleared his throat. Your warriors, they can't all stay here. People will, only 2 will remain. Thomas interrupted. Swift Arrow and Running Bear will tend to my father and help with ranch duties. The others will return to our people. And you? Thomas's smile was unreadable. I will come and go as needed. My father's recovery is my responsibility. As the sun dipped low, painting the hills in amber and gold, the warriors began to mount their horses. Every movement was smooth, purposeful, their departure as seamless and disciplined as their arrival had been. Before leaving, Thomas turned once more to Garrett. You surprised me today, he said quietly. How so? You could have let fear decide for you, could have put your own comfort above my father's life, but you didn't. You did what was right even when it was hard. Garrett felt heat flush his face. I just did what anyone would do. No, Thomas said firmly. You did what a man of honor would do. There's a difference. He swung into his saddle, but just before he joined the others, he called over his shoulder. Swift Arrow and Running Bear will earn their keep. They're skilled hunters, and they know cattle better than you might think. Garrett blinked. Wait, how do they know cattle? Thomas's laughter carried across the fading light. Where do you think we learned to raise horses, McKinley? We've been watching your people for decades, learning what works and what fails. The truth struck Garrett like a jolt. The Apache hadn't been raiding, they'd been studying. Every assumption he'd held about them shattered under the weight of that revelation. As the war party vanished into the deepening dusk, Garrett stood at the edge of something unfamiliar, left behind with Swift Arrow, Running Bear, and a wounded man sleeping peacefully beneath his blankets, pain eased by the doctor's medicine. This is going to be interesting, Garrett muttered under his breath. Swift Arrow heard him and offered a quiet smile. More interesting than you know, McKinley. My grandfather used to say the best lessons come from the most unexpected teachers. What's that supposed to mean? Garrett asked. But Swift Arrow had already turned back to tending the fire, leaving the question to drift unanswered in the evening breeze. And somewhere, buried in the back of Garrett's thoughts, a new and more disturbing question began to take shape. If the Apache knew so much about cattle and ranching, what else did they know about him? 3 weeks later, Joseph Red Hawk was strong enough to sit upright, even share meals by the fire that had become their nightly gathering place. What had started as an uneasy compromise had grown into something deeper, a cooperative rhythm that neither side had expected, but both now depended on. Swift Arrow had shown himself to be a gifted tracker. He located 6 missing cattle down in a rocky canyon Garrett hadn't even realized was part of his land. Running Bear's ability to read the sky was uncanny. Twice, he'd warned of sudden storms that could have wiped out whole sections of livestock, if not for timely movement to higher ground. But the greatest surprise came from Joseph himself. Your grandfather, the old Apache said one evening, as the horizon blazed with oranges and purples, was a good man. Garrett almost choked on his coffee. You knew him? Joseph nodded slowly. During the drought of '62, when the creek ran dry, he let our people water their horses here. Asked for nothing, said water belonged to all living things. The words echoed what Joseph had said the day Garrett found him by the creek. And suddenly it all made sense. This hadn't been trespassing. It had been a return, a journey back, to a place where kindness had once lived. My father never told me that story, Garrett said softly. He was young then, Joseph replied, frightened by the stories others told him about us. But your grandfather, he judged men by their actions, not their blood. Just then, Thomas stepped into the firelight, having arrived for his usual evening visit. He'd been coming every night since his father's injury, and somewhere along the way, Garrett had begun to anticipate those visits. "How are you feeling, Father?" Thomas asked, speaking English now, a quiet nod to Garrett's effort to learn Apache. "Strong enough to ride home," Joseph said with a half-smile, "but not in a rush to leave such good company." Thomas took a long look at the fire circle, the quiet bond forming between Garrett and Swift Arrow as they mapped out the next cattle drive, Running Bear teaching Garrett how to read cloud patterns with a finger pointed skyward. Something in Thomas's gaze softened. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "it's time we discuss the future." Garrett's stomach twisted. He'd known this conversation was coming, and yet he dreaded it, because he knew when this ended, he might be left to face the same cold loneliness that had once defined his life. "What kind of future?" he asked carefully. Thomas sat across from him, face solemn. "My people have been watching the government's plans. There's change coming, railroads, mining, settlements. All of it will impact this land. Yours, ours, everyone's. What does that have to do with me?" "Survival," Thomas answered. No hesitation in his voice. "The old ways, the old divisions, they won't protect us anymore. We need allies who see the value in cooperation over conflict." Swift Arrow looked up from the map. "Thomas is offering you a partnership, McKinley." "A real one?" Garrett paused. He already sensed what this meant. Still, he asked, "What kind of partnership?" Thomas leaned forward. "Your land borders our winter grazing grounds. Your cattle could thrive there during dry seasons. Our horses could benefit from your breeding stock. Together, we could stand stronger when the railroad men and surveyors come through." It was more than fair. Garrett didn't deserve such an offer, yet it made undeniable sense. Alone, ranchers would be vulnerable. Together, they'd be respected and protected. "People in town won't like it," Garrett said honestly. "People in town will adapt," Thomas said, "or they'll be left behind." Joseph rose to his feet slowly, his recovery nearly complete. "My grandfather used to say you learn a man's character not by how he treats his friends, but by how he treats those who are different from him." He fixed his gaze on Garrett. "You've shown your character these past weeks." The words settled on Garrett like a mantle. He was being offered more than a deal. He was being offered belonging, purpose, legacy. "If we do this," Garrett said slowly, "we do it right. Equal partners, shared decisions, mutual respect." Thomas extended his hand. Garrett took it and felt the grip of a man who'd worked the land, faced hardship, earned every callous. "Equal partners," Thomas said, that night, beneath a dome of stars. As plans took shape and the fire crackled between new brothers, Garrett looked back on the journey that had started at the creek's edge. He'd begun that day as a solitary rancher, closed off, wary of difference, but he was ending it with a circle of people who had become something closer than neighbors, something closer to family. And far off in the night, a bird called through the darkness, a reminder that sometimes the greatest changes come not from battles or bloodshed, but from unexpected kindness, from the bravery to listen, the strength to trust, and the quiet courage it takes to open your heart even when fear tells you to shut it. If you're enjoying stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. And if you're ready for something even more powerful, where courage and compassion collide in ways that shake the very bones of the American frontier, click the video on the screen. There's more to this world than meets the eye, and the best stories are still ahead.